That morning started like any other, but the way people looked at me told me something had already changed. Conversation stopped when I walked into the office. A few of the younger employees avoided my eyes. I had spent 32 years in that building, long enough to recognize the quiet tension that hangs in the air before something serious happens. By the time I was called upstairs to the main office, I already knew one thing for certain. Whatever was waiting behind that door was going to change the rest of my life. I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio, back when a man's word was his bond, and you didn't leave a job until they carried you out or the lights went dark. I started Miller & Sons Logistics in a rented warehouse with 2 used trucks and a mountain of debt. My wife, Martha, handled the books on our kitchen table while I drove the overnight routes to Chicago and back. We didn't have much, but we had a plan. Everything I built, every mile I clocked, was for our son, Brandon. I raised him to be better than me. I sent him to the best schools, paid for his MBA at Ohio State, and brought him into the company 10 years ago. I wanted him to see the foundation before he stood on the roof. Last month, after my 72nd birthday, I decided it was time. I officially handed him the keys, stepping back into a consultant role. I thought I was giving him a legacy. I didn't realize I was giving him a weapon. As I walked toward the elevator, I saw Sarah, our receptionist, who's been with us for 20 years, wiping her eyes. She wouldn't look at me. I stepped into the mahogany-lined office on the 4th floor. It used to be my office. Now, Brandon sat behind the desk I bought 30 years ago. He didn't stand up when I walked in. He didn't offer me coffee. He just tapped a pen against a manila folder and stared at the window. "Sit down, Dad," he said. His voice was clipped, professional, the tone he used for vendors he was trying to squeeze. "What's going on, Brandon? The floor is quiet today. People are acting like there's a funeral." He finally looked at me, but I didn't recognize the expression. It was cold. There was no gratitude there, no memory of the nights I spent teaching him how to read a balance sheet, or the weekends we spent fixing those first 2 trucks together. "The board met this morning," he said. "Well, what's left of the transition committee? We've reviewed the new direction for the company. We're modernizing, Dad. We're cutting the legacy costs that are holding us back from the tech integration we need to compete with the big guys in Phoenix and Dallas." "Legacy costs?" I asked, my heart starting to thud against my ribs. "You mean the pension fund or the senior drivers?" Brandon slid a single sheet of paper across the desk. It wasn't a report. It was a termination agreement. "I mean you, Dad," he said, leaning back in my chair. "As of 9 o'clock this morning, your consultancy contract is void. We need a clean break. I can't have the old guard hovering over my shoulder while I'm trying to build the future. You're done." I stared at the paper. My name was there, printed in bold ink. Underneath it was his signature. I raised him. I gave him everything I had. And on his first official day in charge, he was firing the man who gave him the desk he was sitting behind. I looked up at him, waiting for the punchline, for the "just kidding, Dad." But his face remained like stone. The silence in the room was so heavy I could hear the clock on the wall ticking away the seconds of my 32-year career. "You're serious?" I whispered. "I'm a CIO now, Dad," he replied. "I don't have the luxury of being sentimental." I stood up slowly, my knees popping. I didn't sign the paper. I just turned toward the door, but before I left, I saw the one thing Brandon had forgotten in his rush to be a leader. On the corner of the desk was the blue folder containing the master lease for the downtown terminal, the one piece of property I never transferred to the company. "I'll have my things out by noon," I said quietly. "Actually," Brandon said, not even looking up from his laptop, "security is waiting at your cubicle. They'll escort you out now." Walking past those cubicles with 2 young men in cheap suits following me was the longest walk of my life. I had built this floor from an empty shell in 1994, picking out the carpet and the lighting myself so my drivers would have a bright place to come home to after a long haul. Now, my own employees looked at their keyboards as I passed. I saw Marcus, a dispatcher who had been with me since he was 22, start to stand up, but one of the security guards put a hand on his shoulder. I didn't take much. I grabbed the framed photo of Martha from my desk and a small brass bulldog my father had given me when I opened my first checking account. Everything else, the awards, the industry plaques, the 30 years of history, stayed in the drawers. Brandon didn't even come out of his office to watch. He stayed behind that glass, probably already drafting the email to the staff about restructuring for efficiency. When I reached the parking lot, the humid Cleveland air felt like a weight on my chest. I sat in my truck for 20 minutes, just staring at the logo on the side of the building. Miller & Sons Logistics. I had added the Sons part the day Brandon was born, even before I knew if he'd ever want to sit in that chair. I had given him every advantage, paid for every degree, and made sure he never had to worry about the debt that kept me awake in the early years. I drove home to the brick ranch where we'd lived since 1978. Martha was in the garden, clipping roses. She saw my truck pull into the driveway at 10 in the morning and she dropped her shears. "Robert, what are you doing home?" she asked, wiping her hands on her apron. I didn't know how to tell her. I didn't know how to explain that the boy we had spent 50 years loving had just treated me like a line item on a spreadsheet. I walked into the kitchen and sat at the table where we'd eaten 1,000 family dinners. "He fired me, Martha," I said. My voice sounded like it belonged to someone else. "He had security walk me out." She didn't scream. She didn't cry right away. She just sat down opposite me and pressed her fingers into the edge of the table. For a long time, the only sound was the hum of the refrigerator. "He said, 'I'm a legacy cost,'" I whispered. "He said he needs a clean break to build the future." "He's our son," she said, as if that fact alone should have made it impossible. "He's a CEO now," I replied, repeating his words. "He doesn't have the luxury of being sentimental." That evening, the phone didn't ring. No apology from Brandon. No, "Let's talk about this" text from David, our younger son who worked in marketing. It was as if I had ceased to exist the moment I stepped off the property. I went down to my basement workshop, looking at the tools and the old ledgers. I felt a coldness settling in my bones that had nothing to do with the weather. Around 8 o'clock, I pulled a dusty blue folder from the top shelf of my filing cabinet. It was the original deed to the North Terminal land, the 3 acres in the heart of the shipping district. When the company grew, I had leased the land back to Miller & Sons for a nominal fee of $1 a year. It was a technicality I'd kept in my name for tax purposes years ago and never got around to changing. I read the contract twice. The lease had an at-will termination clause for the owner, provided 60 days' notice was given. Brandon wanted a clean break. He wanted to modernize without the old guard holding him back. I looked at the phone on the wall, thinking about calling him one last time to ask him why. But then I remembered the way he looked at me behind that desk, the lack of respect, the absolute certainty that I was a relic he could just discard. I picked up a pen. If I was going to be treated like a business rival instead of a father, then it was time I started acting like one. The following Monday, I didn't go to the office. Instead, I drove to a small law firm in downtown Cleveland, far away from the glass towers where Brandon held his meetings. I met with a man named Arthur Vance, who had been my personal attorney since before Brandon was born. I laid the blue folder on his desk and told him exactly what had happened. The security guards, the legacy cost comments, and the coldness in my son's eyes. "Arthur, I want to trigger the termination clause on the North Terminal lease," I said, "and I want it done by the book. No phone calls, no family dinners, just the papers." Arthur looked at the deed, then at me. "Robert, you realize that the North Terminal is the heart of the company's distribution. If they lose access to that lot, their fuel costs and transit times for the regional routes will double. It could cripple their new modernization plan before it even starts." I raised him to understand logistics, I replied. He should have checked the assets before he cleared out the basement. 2 days later, the notice was served. I spent the afternoon in my backyard, helping Martha with the heavy lifting she usually waited for Brandon to do. But Brandon hadn't visited in 3 weeks. He hadn't called to see how her heart was doing after the stress-induced event she'd suffered a few years back. He was too busy being a CEO. At 4 o'clock, a black SUV pulled into our driveway. Brandon stepped out, his tie loosened, his face flushed with a mixture of confusion and rage. He didn't walk to the porch. He marched straight to where I was standing by the shed. "What is this, Dad?" he demanded, waving the legal notice in the air. "Arthur Vance sent this to our legal department this morning. You're terminating the lease on the North Terminal? That's where 60% of our fleet is staged." "It's a business decision, Brandon," I said, leaning on my shovel. "I'm looking at my personal portfolio and realizing that the $1 a year rent is a legacy cost I can no longer afford to carry. I'm modernizing my retirement." "You're sabotaging me," he yelled. "On my first month, do you have any idea what this does to our contracts?" "I gave you 30 years of my life," I said, my voice dropping to a low, steady rumble. "I gave you a debt-free company and a seat at the head of the table. You chose to have me escorted out by security like a thief. If I'm not part of the company's future, then my land isn't either." "We'll sue," he spat. "We'll tie this up in court for years." "Go ahead," I said. "But the contract is ironclad. You have 60 days to move your trucks, your fuel tanks, and your dispatch office off my property. Or you can pay the new market rate, $50,000 a month, starting Monday." Brandon looked at me as if he was seeing a stranger. He didn't see the father who had packed his lunches or the man who had worked 60-hour weeks so he could go to college debt-free. He saw a competitor. "You're really going to choose a bank account over your own son?" he asked, his voice shaking. "No," I said quietly. "I'm choosing not to be lied to, and I'm choosing to be respected in the house I built." He turned on his heel and stormed back to his car, spraying gravel as he peeled out of the driveway. Martha stood in the doorway, her hand over her mouth. She didn't ask what was in the letter. She had heard enough. That night, the house was silent, but for the first time in weeks, I didn't feel like a ghost. I felt like the man who had started with 2 used trucks and a plan. Brandon thought he could fire the past, but he was about to learn that the past owns the ground he's standing on. By the end of the week, the silence from the corporate office was broken by a flurry of certified letters. Brandon didn't come back to the house, but his expensive defense attorney did. The letters were cold, filled with legal jargon that painted me as a bitter old man, maliciously escalating a private family matter. I sat at my kitchen table, reading those words over and over, while the coffee went cold in my hand. It was a strange feeling, being treated like a criminal by the person I had raised and given everything. I drove down to the North Terminal on Tuesday morning just to see the chaos for myself. The yard was a mess. Drivers were idling their rigs by the gate, confused by the new logistics Brandon had implemented. I saw Marcus, my old dispatcher, standing by the fuel pumps looking exhausted. He saw my truck and walked over, leaning his arms against the window. "It's a disaster, Robert," Marcus said quietly. He cut the maintenance budget to pay for a new automated tracking suite from some firm in Seattle. 2 of the reefers broke down near Columbus yesterday, and we lost the whole load of produce. "Where's Brandon?" I asked. "In meetings," Marcus replied with a bitter laugh. "He's trying to convince the bank that the terminal lease issue is just a technicality. But the suppliers are getting nervous. They've heard the rumors that the business hasn't been solvent for some time." I looked at the yard I had paved with my own hands 30 years ago. I felt a pang of sadness, not for the money, but for the pride I used to feel when I saw the Miller logo on those clean, well-maintained trucks. Now they looked worn, and the men looked even worse. Brandon was so focused on the future that he was letting the present crumble into the dirt. That evening, my younger son David finally showed up at the house. He didn't come to apologize for his brother or to check on Martha's health. He stood in the living room like an executive about to negotiate a merger. "Dad, you have to stop this," David said, his voice tight with frustration. "Mark is drowning. If the bank sees that we've lost the lease on the main terminal, they'll pull our line of credit. You're blowing up the family." "I didn't do that, David," I said, my voice steady. "Your brother did that when he decided I was a legacy cost to be discarded. He used his father's name like it was nothing, and then he expected me to sit in the basement and stay quiet while he dismantled my life's work." "It was just paperwork, Dad," David argued, using that same phrase Brandon loved. "Don't make it bigger than it is." "My dignity isn't paperwork," I replied. "And your mother's peace of mind isn't a technicality." Martha walked into the room then. She looked smaller than she had a month ago, her hands shaking just a little as she adjusted her robe. She looked at David for a long time, and for the first time in 53 years of marriage, I saw a hardness in her eyes that mirrored my own. "You boys were supposed to protect each other," she said softly. "Not use us as collateral for your ambitions." David had no answer for her. He just looked at his phone, exhaled slowly, and walked out without hugging her. When the door clicked shut, the house felt too quiet. I looked at the framed photos of my sons in their Little League uniforms on the wall. I had worked 39 years to build something solid for them. Now, I was realizing that the strongest structures are the ones that have to be torn down and rebuilt from the foundation up. By the following Monday, the tension had spread far beyond the walls of my home. I received a phone call from a collections officer at the bank named Mr. Reynolds, who spoke in a tone that suggested he had made this call many times before. He informed me that the company's business line of credit was in jeopardy because the North Terminal, the very land I owned, was listed as a primary asset in their original filing. "Mr. Miller," he said, "we're reviewing recovery options. If the balance isn't satisfied or the lease secured, we'll begin formal proceedings." Formal proceedings meant liens and possibly foreclosure on the business assets. I called a meeting. I told David to bring Mark and Andrew to the house. They arrived after 8, the first time I'd seen all three together in weeks. Andrew tried to lighten the mood with that same phrase that was starting to make my blood boil. "Let's not make this bigger than it is." I placed the bank's latest warning on the table. Then I placed a second document next to it, a forensic review I'd requested from Arthur Vance's office. "Mark," I said, "your company hasn't paid payroll taxes in 6 months." He stared at me, his face turning a ghostly shade of pale. "Where did you get that?" "It's public record," I replied. "You didn't miss your mother's 75th birthday because you were busy. You missed it because you didn't want to sit at this table and explain that the business was collapsing." David shifted in his chair, his voice dropping to something sharp. "Dad, digging around like this isn't helpful." "Helpful," Margaret said quietly from the doorway. "Helpful would have been telling us the truth." Mark slammed his hand down on the mahogany table. "I was trying to protect you." "From what?" I asked. "The consequences of your own choices?" I looked at my 3 sons. I had raised them to be honest men. I had given them every advantage, working 60-hour weeks so they could start their lives debt-free. Now, they were looking at me like I was the enemy because I refused to let them use my retirement as a safety net for their lies. "I'm meeting with my own attorney tomorrow," I said, "and from this point forward, you will communicate through him." "Dad, that's extreme." David blinked. "No," I said, my voice as cold as the Lake Erie wind. "What's extreme is firing your father and then expecting him to fund the bridge you're burning." They left angrier than they arrived, leaving the house in a silence that felt heavier than any argument. That night, Margaret sat beside me on the couch and asked the question that had been haunting us both. "Are we going to lose everything, Robert?" I looked around the living room, at the worn armchair and the photos of the boys in their Little League uniforms. "I don't know," I said, and for the first time in my life, I truly meant it. The next morning, I drove downtown to meet with Arthur Vance again. The office was in an older brick building, nothing like the glass tower where Brandon spent his days. Arthur sat across from me, his expression more serious than I had ever seen it in 30 years. He slid a new set of documents across the desk, Copies of the corporate filings Brandon had submitted to the bank to secure the latest expansion loan. Robert, I had a forensic expert look at the signature pages on the loan guarantee, Arthur said quietly. The one dated last October. Last October? I asked. My heart skipped a beat. Martha was in the hospital with pneumonia then. I never left her bedside for 3 days. Arthur turned the page toward me. There it was. My signature. Martha's too, but we hadn't signed a single thing that month. The report shows these were digitally lifted from an older document and placed onto this new agreement, Arthur explained. Forgery. The word hung in the air like a thick fog. My own son hadn't just fired me. He had used my identity to gamble with our house and our savings while his mother was fighting for her breath in a hospital bed. If you move forward with this, Robert, Arthur warned, it's not just a civil matter anymore. It's criminal exposure for whoever submitted these. I felt a coldness settle in my chest that no heater could touch. I went home and waited. I didn't call. I didn't text. I knew they would come. They showed up that evening, all 3 of them. Brandon looked pale. The bravado of the modern CEO completely evaporated. David and Andrew stood behind him like bodyguards for a man who had already lost the war. Dad, we heard about the audit, Brandon said, his voice cracking. I was drowning. The vendors were cutting us off. I thought I could fix it before you ever noticed. You signed your mother's name while she was on a ventilator, Brandon, I said, my voice barely a whisper. We're family, Dad, he pleaded, stepping forward. If the bank goes to the prosecutor, I could lose everything. I could go to prison. You already lost everything, Martha said from the top of the stairs. She was holding onto the railing, her face like stone. You lost our trust. You lost this home. And you lost the right to call yourself our son. David tried to intervene, his voice sharp with desperation. If you let this go to court, you'll tear this family apart permanently. I looked at my 3 sons, the men I had built a legacy for, the boys I had given every ounce of my life to. This family was torn apart the moment you decided your parents were just pieces of paper to be used, I said. I walked to the kitchen counter and picked up my phone. I had already recorded a video statement, laying out the dates and the facts. I'm not protecting you anymore, I said into the silence of the room. The truth is the only thing left in this house. They left without saying another word. As the taillights of their expensive SUVs disappeared down the street, I sat at the table with Martha. Her hand was shaking, but her grip on mine was firm. What happens now? She asked. Now, I said, we see what's left when the lies are gone. The winter in Cleveland was brutal that year, matching the coldness that had settled into the foundation of my life. Mark's business finally collapsed under the weight of the fraud investigation and the terminated lease. The bank didn't care about family dinners or 30 years of history. They cared about the forged signatures and the unpaid debts. Mark accepted a plea deal to avoid the worst of the criminal charges, but it cost him his professional license and the house in the suburbs he was so proud of. David and Andrew stopped calling altogether, retreating into their own lives and blaming me for blowing up the family by refusing to lie to the prosecutors. I sat in my kitchen, the same one where I used to pack their school lunches, and realized that giving your children everything doesn't always make them good men. Sometimes it just makes them believe the world owes them a safety net, even if they have to tear their own parents apart to build it. Martha and I sold the brick ranch in December. It wasn't because we couldn't pay the taxes, but because every room echoed with the sound of arguments and the ghosts of sons who no longer existed to us. We moved into a small condo on the west side of the city, a place with no stairs and no memories tied to signatures. On New Year's Eve, we sat at a small table with just 2 chairs. There was no party, no grand celebration, just the quiet hum of the heater and the steady weight of 53 years of marriage. Martha reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Do you think they'll ever understand?" she asked softly. "It doesn't matter anymore," I replied. I had spent my whole life building a legacy for them, thinking that a company and a name were the most important things a father could leave behind. I was wrong. The only thing I truly owned was my integrity, and I had to break my own heart to keep it. The snow continued to fall against the window, blurring the lights of the city I had helped build. I picked up the final envelope from the prosecutor's office, confirming the cases were closed, and placed it in the back of a desk drawer. Then, I turned off the light. If this story meant something to you, subscribe. There's more to come.